Today's episode is brought to you by DeSanto Propane. DeSanto Propane is 4 generations strong as a trustworthy family-owned business with unmatched customer service. Go online at DeSantoPropane.com for more info or call toll-free at 1-800-752-4574. Since 1937, the difference has been DeSanto Propane. Your feedback rules the day. I'm Josh Durso with Jackie Augustine here inside the Fingerlakes1.com studio, and this is the Debrief Podcast. Today we are going all in on housing. So far in 2025, there have been dozens of headlines about housing-related issues across upstate New York. It's been subject to debate in Albany as the 2026 budget was worked out. There have been public hearings on housing projects across the Finger Lakes and central New York, but the through line is housing shortages getting worse across the board. So today's episode, I think, really kind of started with your column in the Finger Lakes Times, Doing the Right Thing. Like, what was the thing that got you to write that column?
Okay, you want autobiography? No, I'm just joking. So the most immediate thing that got me to write the column is that, the county has this housing task force, as you know, and they had just published a piece in the Finger Lakes Times saying, hey, we have a housing problem in Ontario County, and we need to do something about it, which again, I thought was good to say that, but also, yes, there are many of us who've been saying that for years, who saw it coming, who aren't taken by surprise by what's happening, and who have actually been participating in data-driven research and solutions for these kinds of problems. Yet, one of the recommendations from the county's housing study that they paid tax dollars to conduct was that the county needs to be serious about housing and have a housing department, and that the housing department needs to be officials who actually are well-versed in these topics and are working on it in a coordinated way, who are talking about policy, talking about projects, talking with the municipalities about zoning and restrictions, and talking to the IDAs about pilots, and really getting a clear plan. And that still is the missing piece. It still feels very disjointed and slow. And I will say, because I know I understand, government is not a rapid fire operation. And I'm glad, because we're seeing on a national level all the things that go wrong when you try to just get in and be rapid about things without knowing what you're doing. So I'm not saying that I'm frustrated with the pace completely. It's just that I felt like we had a really long on-ramp to this problem, and I'm still feeling like there aren't a lot of solutions coming forward when there seem to be some low-hanging fruit that we could work on right away, but it's going to take centralized, consolidated messaging from the county to the municipalities. And I think the county's taking a very passive role in terms of what can we do? Our hands are tied. This is a local issue. And not every county has taken that approach, and they've had more success than we're having.
Yes. Okay, so part of the reason why I wanted to start there is because obviously people who know me know that housing is the number one issue that since my days of since I hung up my pencil as a day-to-day journalist, housing is the number one issue that I've continued to work on in the community across the region. And I would say this about that particular piece that you referenced in the Finger Lakes Times, which I think was the 3rd or 4th installment of a 12-ish installment series that the ad hoc committee is working on. I would say that your experience as someone who is plugged in and understands that there is a problem and it requires significant action is in the minority, is a minority take. And I don't mean that as as an insult. I just mean that as quite literally 90% of the population in the Finger Lakes region is looking at housing saying, what are you talking about? There's no problem.
Yes, unfortunately, that's true.
The house that I bought for $6,000 in 1968 is worth $400,000 now. It's a Sears catalog home that was put together like Lincoln Logs. It's worth $500,000. What's wrong with that? And that's probably, in my estimation, the main thing that they are trying to address. The ad hoc committee is trying to address.
Sorry, I just need to interject for 1 second.
Sure.
And I know that the numbers that you were giving are not like, I know you were just making a point that the majority of people don't have this experience.
Yep.
But I would just like to say at the start, because I think this is important framing for the whole issue, the majority of people who are in a position to do something about it don't understand the problem. I actually think the majority of county residents are experiencing the housing crisis and do know what's happening. So I just want to qualify. I think Finger Lakes residents in general get that there's a problem with housing. Unfortunately, the people we've elected are the ones who haven't picked up on what's happening yet because they live in this bubble of everything's fine for me and that should be my primary concern. Sorry.
No, I agree. It's interesting because like there's this theme that I wanted to talk to you about. It kind of like centers around what I was saying before, but like that scarcity is beneficial for some. And that's kind of where we are right now. Like right at the end of the day, like everybody knows that when it comes to housing, Ontario County, Seneca County, literally name your county just needs more housing, literally all of it. Yep. Like period. So when scarcity is benefiting some people, like I wrote down a couple notes that I'd gotten after I wrote a Substack in, I think it was January. One was, I don't want my home to lose value. And if we build as much housing as you describe, it will, which I thought was a real, but thematic of what I hear. Yep. And then another one was, you don't get it. Once you've lived through a housing recession, you'd never want to see your home's value decline either, which was another piece. And again, I think so much of the housing debate is centered around there needing to be this like existential value in it that it hasn't allowed us to be able to create the supply that we need to meet the demand of not today. Like we aren't even really meeting the demand of 10 years ago.
Yes, agreed. And I mean, I don't want to jump immediately into a Geneva thing, but I will just say that a recent example is that...
Jump away.
Okay. So there's this like flyer going around and anyway, I'm sorry, I can't refer to it without laughing because I feel like anybody who's looking at it is like, wow, Geneva doesn't have any graphic designers, I guess, but that's not, I don't mean to disparage the flyer on those grounds because there are plenty of other reasons it's bad. But the landlords of certain properties are so upset by the prospect that additional units are going to come into the market that their exorbitantly high rents they've been charging for buildings that many of them are putting very little of that back into. I mean, their business model of exploitation, let's call it what it is threatened by additional supply because I brought with me pages of the comprehensive plan because it has never failed us. It only fails the people who don't read it, which is, again, to go back to the initial thing, everybody who's making a decision these days, unfortunately. But not everybody. But, the idea is that we are perpetuating what the plan calls a toxic marriage of people who have some resources who have invested in property and real estate, who have a vice grip on an increasingly captive market of people who need housing and will have to pay whatever they demand for it because there isn't enough choice. And if the county, this was the motivation behind my piece that you're citing, if the county doesn't understand that government should be in the business, if anything, of making sure that its residents have choices in their lives that are meaningful and responsible, then it's failing. And Ontario County is failing the residents of the county when it comes to housing choice. There is no meaningful choice, not just for renters, but for seniors, for small families, for people who work in the wine industry and other service-based industries to actually live their lives.
Yeah, I agree. So one of the interesting themes that has cropped up here, and I want to talk about this because I think this is part of the problem why we haven't seen action in a lot of communities, not just Ontario County, but literally everywhere. We need density. We need more housing. We need more everything. And we need it all closer together. I was reading a piece by Bill Fulton, a planner who's written a couple books on Substack the other day. And he is sort of describing this scenario where, there's been a push in the last year or two to try to build more commercial space in around housing and bring it all in and sort of create these like neighborhoods within cities within cities, right? Especially for smaller cities. Auburn, Geneva, Canandaigua would be a few local examples of that size, roughly like 10,000. But, I comb Facebook for feedback in some of these like Facebook groups when various proposals or developments are being discussed or debated. And there's this like loop where people will like lament a lack of growth and then wag their finger at proposed opportunities for growth. And it creates this scenario where sometimes I think when we're talking about what characteristics make a community itself, like defining characteristics, some of those defining characteristics are the things that are actually killing the community.
Yes.
And unfortunately, and I use this as a benchmark because I think this would be kind of crazy. Like if you have a community of roughly 10,000 people and there is a project that is being proposed, and whether it's a housing project or I guess anything else, 50 people show up and 45 of those people say, we don't want this. This is bad for the community. And 5 people say this is good or I don't have strong feelings about it. You've heard from less than 0.5% of the total population. And yet if it's a zoning board, a planning board, or a town board where a lot of these decisions get made, that project at the very least is going to face some serious slowdowns, if not be killed entirely. And I used that number, like I used 50 because I think that would be like that would be crazy turnout for like a zoning board meeting, right? But a lot of times we see it only takes 5 or 10 people to show up to a zoning board meeting or a planning board meeting to completely stifle a proposed housing development or rental unit or whatever the case, but planned rental development. And that's problematic. Like that is problematic in terms of getting to a solution, because one of these issues is like, you have to start doing something. Like you have to start accepting some kind of development in order to reverse course on some of these issues that are now decades long.
Yes, and I would actually say, though, it's problematic in 2 ways. The first way is that, yes, you shouldn't always, you shouldn't govern based on a perpetual straw poll. Because if that's what you want, then why are you taking a paycheck for being an elected official? Because you're not doing anything. Right. You are supposed to be actually conducting yourself in a professional way that looks like governing, right? And again, going back to the comp plan, right, that was supposed to be this decision-making matrix that would help us be a more professional, prosperous community. And one of the things it says is that we will not ignore evidence-based challenges to proposals, right? But we also aren't going to let our gut overrule reason. And this is the problem. So first, I agree with you that you basically make development proposals thumbs up or thumbs down based on a small handful of people who are saying a whole variety of things, right? Like, I mean, look at some of the conversations in Geneva about this Lakeview project. I mean, people are trying to weaponize mental health. They're going on and on about parking, which is a separate and quite hilarious point, given the fact that many of the people complaining most about parking are themselves not complying with what we all agree is an outdated requirement. But separate discussion. But the other reason that it's harmful for people to govern this way is because sometimes the objections being raised are evidence-based and are policy issues that need to be considered, right? So taking like the Lakeview project as an example, though I really hate to emphasize certain elements of this that I don't think are being offered with any genuine intent other than to protect somebody's bottom line who doesn't want more housing. I think that the problem is that we need to be able to have a mature adult conversation about elements of projects that are brought to the table. And when instead it is this mob rule mentality, and we're just going to count up how many people showed up that are for it and how many people that showed up are against it, nobody's asking the questions that will actually lead to responsible, sustainable development. I mean, look at Geneva has a great example of a project in which the straw poll showed go forward and nobody asked the hard questions, and look at where that got us. So I'm not saying, yes, ignore opposition and speed everything through. I don't agree with that. I'm saying there has to be a process to sort out legitimate concerns that are evidence-based versus I don't like this, which can be loud and compelling and can scare people. And when you've got a city run by people who lack a lot of courage, you end up in this morass that we find ourselves in, where sometimes they fast track bad stuff and prevent good stuff, and you never know what you're going to get because they don't actually ask any useful questions of the developers.
And I would just like to add to what you're saying and remind everybody who's listening and watching that this is not just a Geneva problem.
Yes,
this happens literally everywhere. Literally everywhere. And it's so one of the issues that I always come back to, and I want to ask, like, we exchanged some emails about potential solutions, like sort of a dream big situation. I think we both had some ideas that I think would be considered too bold for political appetite, perhaps.
Sure.
But
story of my life, I guess. I'm always, yeah.
So before we get to that, though, one thing that one question I wanted to throw at you is this: like, how can a county like Ontario or Wayne or Cayuga possibly unify housing and create like basically a focused housing development effort when home rule exists and you have every municipality, I think I don't know, maybe in Ontario County, it's around like 16 or 18 municipalities. I'm not sure. Don't quote me. There's a lot. There's over a dozen though. With their own rules, their own zoning, their own villages, towns, cities. From the perspective of someone who is like now, I'm in zone. I am in zoning in terms of being on a zoning board. Like seeing how nuanced one municipality's zoning laws are compared to another's, compared to another, creates like a lot of complexity that really makes me wonder if without stripping some of that away, it's even possible to create a real like effort at the county level in any upstate New York county on something as big as housing.
Well, I do think there are some ways. And again, I guess you're right. They will be seen as too bold, or I guess the word's usually radical that is associated with me, but for whatever reason. But I think here's a crazy concept, right? What if we actually engaged in performance-based governing? What if we actually said at the county level, listen, we control the purse strings of a lot of things, and we are interested in supporting and incentivizing certain types of outcomes, like more affordable housing, more middle market housing. Let's also explain to people affordable housing. People throw that term around, and if you ask them, they will rarely be correct in telling you what it means. Again, let's keep in mind the median incomes of this area. I think we got a lot of people who feel like they're rich and don't need affordable housing and don't understand that according to the actual standards, they're right in the middle of what would apply as affordable. So again, I think there are some like educational pieces that need to be in the mix. But again, you would expect elected officials to know these things, so we could maybe start with expecting more of them. But then if the county were able to say, for example, we are able to pull our planning board oversight, our county planning board oversight, to account for a lot more local projects than we're doing right now. Right now, the county planning is allowed to weigh in when there's a direct county interest as they define it. I think Ontario County could say, you know what? The provision of housing, the obstacles to housing like lot lines, density requirements, parking restrictions, we now see those as integral to our county interests. You'd get a lot more stuff that would have to go through county planning board review. Now, is the county planning board ready for that? Do they have the tools? Would they know what to do? I don't know yet, but they could also point out all the non-compliant planning board issues around the county, right? Planning boards are actually supposed to undergo training. They are supposed to have professional development. They are a quasi-municipal agency for which people can sue, and they are supposed to be trained, zoning board and planning board. How many of our planning and zoning board members are in compliance with those requirements? Again, it's about professionalizing government. You have a job to do. Do the job. Get the training for the job. We'll support you in the job, but actually do the job and don't just do your neighbor's bidding in a seat.
So I would venture to guess that nearly all of them are properly trained by New York State standards. However, I know from personal experience and just the eyeball test that there isn't a lot of turnover in these positions because people aren't knocking down the door to jump on the zoning board or the planning board. And that's part of the problem. I think that's part of the problem is that, you mentioned, do the job right, essentially, and don't just do your neighbor's bidding. I think, unfortunately, there are a lot of feelings getting factored into planning and zoning board decisions rather than just the structural X's and O's of, does this meet our law? Does this meet the requirements of what we expect as a community? And I really don't think there's a lot of comp plan consideration going into a lot of these decisions either, to your point. So obviously people expect a town board or city council to really be paying attention to a comprehensive plan, but really zoning and planning should be too.
Oh, yeah.
Right? So
it's supposed to be part of the training.
Yeah. So, and unfortunately, as with a lot of things, I see a lot of planning and zoning board members in different communities across the whole region get into an autopilot almost. They either say yes a lot or they say no a lot. And there's, not really a lot of in between. And I think, sometimes the communities where a lot of yes is happening get sort of swept away in the they must be doing things right because they're just saying yes to everything. When in reality, they're guilty of the same problem. They're doing the same thing wrong. It's just not having the impact that the no's are having. To me, one of the things that I kind of feel like we're working our way toward is this moment where New York State wakes up and decides, sorry, you don't get to have home rule anymore. And I know a lot of people are going to say, oh no, Josh, that's baked into the Constitution. And listen, the Democrats control all three levers of government. To me, it was absolutely shocking, 2 years ago, when Hochul's bigger housing proposals were essentially shot down by, or neutered by Democrats. Mm-hmm. When New York State decides that it is going to force communities to build fast and furious and suspend whatever local home rules you hold near and dear, it's going to happen whether you like it or not.
Yeah. Well, it's already starting to happen because if you look at the, housing, I forget what the classification is, but certain communities had to opt in to be housing friendly communities or something. There's money tied to that.
Yes.
And that's what I'm
pro-housing community.
Pro-housing community. Thank you. That's on a state level, an example of what I'm saying at the county level, right? It is a performance-based way of governing. Now, I mean, don't get me started on the Democrats. I always, the old adage that I belong to no organized party because I'm a Democrat holds true, right? There is no universal democratic position on how to do housing. There are many ideas. I think that what we're seeing, though, is a recognition that what has been happening, which is just letting people figure it out piecemeal on their own, has caused the problem that we're in. And so there does need to be guidance and direction that actually is grounded in facts and economic realities.
Yeah.
To go back to something you were saying before about the inconsistencies, because I hate to keep picking on Geneva, because like you say, even, my comments about planning and zoning boards were not Geneva specific and weren't even necessarily about Geneva's planning board, but instead about the concept in general. And I think you mentioned community conversation and perception, and I think this is a really important piece. People lament that businesses close, that they lose services. We don't have a movie theater, Freihofer's closed, right? Like we've talked about that on the show.
Oh, yeah.
Economists explain why this happens, if anybody cares to listen, right? Geneva is an outlier in Ontario County in terms of population loss. People say, why does Canandaigua get this? Why does Victor have this? Why does Farmington have that? They are seeing population growth. People think we have to have the businesses first and then we'll get the residents. And people don't understand it is kind of a chicken and egg problem, but really the evidence shows you have to have a critical mass. You have to achieve critical mass of population if you want the services you want to be there. You have to build the economic, social, and political capital to get things done. And it's missed. I mean, even look at the city had a budget discussion last night, and they're going on and on about economic development and public safety, and they don't understand, how do you pay for these services? How do you actually establish a base for economic development, for shops to open, if you aren't getting your housing issue under control? How do they not see that as an economic job number one? Answer for that. Why don't they see it?
Well, and I think about some of these housing issues where it's like so much time is spent trying to account for the concerns that a half dozen people have, instead of dealing with the real problems themselves, that I think sometimes like elected officials get overwhelmed or overwhelm themselves because they are sitting in those meetings with 5, 10, 15 people who are saying, I don't want this, and not keeping the scale of the problem front and center. Like right now in Ontario County, there's a massive development in Canandaigua that's coming down the line. You've got, 3 or 4 housing projects in Geneva that are
5.
5. You've got a couple in the Farmington area. You've got 1 or 2 that have already come online recently in the Victor area. We could turn the lights on all of those tomorrow, and Ontario County is still going to be vastly under supplied.
Right, we're still
in
behind.
housing.
Yes.
Yeah. And instead of keeping that centered at all times, a lot of times what we end up seeing are planning board, zoning board, city councils, town boards get lost in the people who are saying, I don't want to see this building happen because, and they cite some things that, to your point, may not be based on anything real scientific, and that does an unbelievable amount of damage to momentum. And momentum is really important when it comes to these things, because especially when you're relying, remember, capitalism wins the day here, right? Like developers talk to each other, and at the end of the day,
yes, definitely,
like the things developers hear either prompt them to or prompt them to not decide to even pursue things in different communities. So that is like another part of the, now I know, and great segue here, because I know you mentioned there are other methods to fixing this problem, or at least adding to the supply in a way that doesn't just wait on the developer to show up with a check and desire to put up a building. Let's talk about those.
Okay. Well,
At least put some idea. I'm obviously putting you on the spot, not asking you to,
no,
give an in-depth
happy
breakdown here, but put some ideas in people's minds, because I think outside of, the developer-led senior housing project, or like a lakeside project, or, just a traditional single-family housing development like what we're seeing happen in Canandaigua, people aren't really aware of like the other options.
yeah. Yeah. So, a couple of things in the zoning. Most immediately, I don't know. Again, there's this like discussion about selling off parks and playgrounds, which again, like, guys, like, do your homework. Like,
Parks are a huge selling point for communities.
People choose where to live because they want they want the open space. You have open space in Ward 1 that everybody, the comp plan, the zoning consultants who pitched the zoning, everybody said, here is a residential neighborhood that has parcels of property that are residence-based that could be developed. And council, again, in response to a few people, said, no, we don't want to touch that area. We don't want to change the character of this agricultural zone, which...
There are those in Geneva?
It's, certain people tends to be certain wealth levels get what they want, while other people at other wealth levels get stuck with what no one else wants. And that is not something this council's interested in fixing. But zoning changes could be relatively quick and very effective. Lifting a prohibition on accessory dwelling units. That's a quick thing. You know how quickly someone could get a tiny house, add an in-law apartment, do some of the things that would add units to the market quickly? We're talking about one construction season, not multiple years, which some of these other projects are going to take.
Oh, yeah.
And what does that do? That allows a young family to potentially move a member of their family or somebody else, into this accessory unit. And then guess what happens to that person's home that was getting too much for them to take care of? It goes on the market so that another young family or worker can purchase a home, build some equity, maybe put an accessory dwelling unit there too, and then have 2 usable housing units on the market. This multiplier effect is easy. I hate to call anything easy. It is easy. That is low-hanging fruit. It's been recommended for years and ignored for years. I don't know why. Maybe because 4 people's relatives said they don't like it. There isn't a good reason not to do it.
It's happening everywhere, and it's a matter of othering, essentially. Like, where ADUs have been permitted, there are typically a lot of strings attached. Must be a relative, and they are contingencies that just defeat the purpose, right? Like in that case, in what you're describing is bringing more units online, but if only family members of the property owner can access them, then how much of a solution are you just moving your kids from the basement to, the backyard? What are we really fixing there? While I agree that ADUs are part of the solution and definitely one of the easiest short-term fixes, I honestly think that there needs to be a quicker process for moving commercial to residential and vice versa, being able to flex between the two, because, best use may vary, every 5 or 10 years.
Right.
And forcing property owners, developers, whoever the case may be, to go through an arduous variance request process, which can add months to just a simple, upgrade to a property or change of use to a property, can really, like, in terms of housing units, that's a big challenge. Another thing that I have been kind of watching more carefully over the last couple of years is, you drive through any old community with an abundance of housing close to downtown, and you'll see a lot of them, you will see a bunch of houses operating as businesses, because in the 60s, 70s, and 80s, a lot of a lot of homes were converted into commercial businesses. And that's something that we need to, that's one of the reasons why I think there should be nimbleness in
Yes.
use for things like housing. But also just as a best practice, I think that's one of the bigger mistakes that any community made from, say, the early 70s through the early 2000s was allowing that to happen, because you took a lot of potential housing offline completely. And because of how complicated it is moving something from commercial to residential in a lot of communities, it just doesn't happen. So to me, that's one of the things that I would like to see more communities embrace is, perhaps it doesn't have to be a universal thing, but under certain circumstances, allowing some nimbleness in zoning so that, property can be leveraged for its best use. Right now, that's housing.
Yes.
Everything should be on the table to increase the number of units. When I think about ADUs, my curiosity comes from what's the long game on that? Because while I understand that it would bring more units online, I think the number of potential like the customer base for ADUs is smaller than it is for, say, like apartment buildings or, housing near downtown, you know what I mean? And realistically, that's what we need. We just need more housing closer to the center of every single community.
Yes. I mean, and that's why none of these solutions are the answer, right? It has to be all cylinders firing, right? We've got to be working on embracing some of these restrictions. I mean, we've talked a lot about loosening restrictions. One restriction that needs to be tightened that we are so behind on is the rental housing, or not the vacation rental,
yes.
Right?
You read my mind.
Now it sounds like the state has understood that local municipalities are just too reluctant to do it because too many people hold seats by people who are making money from it, that they're not doing the regulations, and therefore the state is starting to step in. But even with that, even if this 45-day prohibition goes through where it can't be purchased, a property can't be purchased by an investment LLC until it's been on the market, even if that can be enforced, it's not enough.
No.
And local communities actually need to take this issue on. But you can see they are so loath to do it. They refuse to just view it as just another business. They have no problem regulating other businesses, but they refuse to look at it that way and actually think, okay, we regulate restaurants with a look toward public health. We regulate bars with an eye toward responsible consumership and checking people's licenses and making sure bad things don't happen. Each business has controls in place for the social harms that you're trying to prevent, and nobody's looking at the vacation rental industry in that way because they're I keep coming back to this notion of fear. I mean, we have a real lack of political courage going on.
I don't think, when it comes to vacation rentals, and I'm glad you brought that up because that's actually where I wanted to go next. I don't think it's fear. To me, it's a part of the economy. And when you realize, I think as an exercise, no matter where you're listening right now from, go on to Airbnb or Vrbo and put in your address. And I think most people would be shocked at the number of short-term rentals that are available in your neighborhood around you that you had absolutely no idea were short-term rentals. And fear, maybe that's maybe some kind of fear, but I think the real fear is the acknowledgement that it is a part of the economy. It is a part of this tourism economy that we have created, which I think is really and Fingerlakes tourism is amazing for a million reasons. But when you're a service-based industry with predominantly low wages and housing is in short supply because short-term housing is kind of essential to a tourism economy, you're in this unbelievably terrible catch-22 where, yeah, short-term rentals are a big part of, I would say probably 80% of, the 30-somethings I know own second properties that they use that are on these places. They move, instead of moving from a starter home into their second home, they've turned their original starter home into a short-term rental, and like you don't have this turnover in the market. And I know I'm kind of speaking from a privileged space where I'm saying that, but like it's so common. It's so common, and it's so problematic. But when you start to have that conversation and say, I don't think this is a good idea from a policy standpoint, we probably shouldn't be doing this, you're met with people saying, well, why? I need that. Right. Like you're affecting my ability to survive and make a living. Why are you doing that? Why do you want to do that? And that's like, to me, I think that's the thing they're responding to more than like any kind of like fear of like trying to step on someone's toes. Or that's what it seems like to me.
Well, I mean, I do think I think that's the fear, right? The fear is that they hear immediately back from the people who are about to be impacted, and they don't want to make them upset.
Yeah.
That's what I mean by like lack of political courage, because here's the thing. I'm not trying to malign short-term rentals. Mm-hmm. I think they are an important part of a tourist-based economy, and I think we should be glad that so many people want to come to the Finger Lakes, that there is this demand.
Right.
But again, if we look at it as a business and as part of the economy, why is registering, paying a fee, there is a provision, which again, I wrote a column about, and nobody on council seemed at all interested in discussing. They can be taxed at a different rate because it is a commercial property. If you don't live in it, right? I understand if somebody owns their home and they're renting a room, or if they have an ADU in their backyard and they're renting that, that's a different beast, right? I'm talking about investors, whether they do live in the municipality or not, who have second, third properties that they do not occupy any days of the year, who are using housing stock as their business. They are running a business, and they should contribute to the economy, not just by benefiting from it, but also contributing to offsetting the harms that practice creates. And we expect that of every other business, and we just seem to not have the stomach to do it. And again, I will say, people who can afford to do this are wealthy. And people who are wealthy exert an undue influence on small local governments, because the people who get elected want to think that they're part of that group, and they don't want to be on their bad side. And you can turn on any local government meeting and you'll see that.
The irony here is, from my perspective, you don't even have to be having this conversation that we're having if there's a glut of housing.
Right.
Like if you just allow more housing, you don't have to worry about restricting one kind of rental property versus another, because there's enough and people are able to access it, and the wheels of the bus move. But, as it stands right now, like 75% of U.S. households are priced out. So, the National Association of Home Builders say 3 out of 4 households can't afford a medium-priced home. Combine that with the fact that nobody knows the difference between affordable housing, regular old housing, and workforce housing. Last year, first-time home buyers, almost 40 years old, which is just beyond alarming. Like that, you want red lights going off all over the place. First-time home buyers cannot be closing in on 40 years old, and like 60, I want to say it's 67 or 68% of renters don't think they'll be able to afford a home in the next 5 years. Like all of this, all the data all the survey data points to there being a real issue where you just need to build more. Now, what's the responsibility of the municipality? I think every municipality should be required that they understand what percentage of their residents are renting, what percentage of their housing stock are rental units, what percentage are homeowners, what percentage are free and clear homeowners, meaning they've like paid off their mortgage. Like there is a real lack of knowledge and data terms on a lot of town boards, city councils. And, some people will listen to that and say, well, I know I'm in government and I know what's going on. If you are, you're an outlier.
Right.
Truly. It's just not the norm. And without that, I remember, oh my God, I think it was the city of Auburn who, going back probably like 5 years now, was moving through the process of creating a rental database on the city's behalf. It was hit with all kinds of opposition. Yep. The symbol, just the idea of a community trying to sort out how much it does or doesn't have was met with that kind of opposition. The kind of opposition that was enough to slow it down is, a reflection of a community and communities in general that are really behind the eight ball. And frankly, I'm not sure how they're going to push forward. There are even more, like you mentioned ADUs, when we were exchanging emails, you had mentioned a couple other, like even more, I think, what some people would refer to as diabolical solutions to housing that are far more radical, far more radical than what you described, but would be perfectly fine in like being part of like multiple solutions, not just saying that, community owned or, kind of like a group owned scenario is the only solution, but just saying that we need this and all of them. We need all of the things.
Well, it's almost like what would benefit municipalities would be a close look, like you were saying, at the housing stock, an evaluation of the unique needs that go along with each type of housing, a look at the types of buildings and solutions that might fit those particular buildings, which I feel like we have this, I don't know where the camera is here. Anyway, we have this comprehensive plan. People usually read, if they read any of it, the first part one, which are the snazzy, pretty pages that give that decision-making matrix, right? That the intention was that council would refer to that and the planning board and the zoning board for all decisions so that we'd actually be a professional group that could be taken seriously. But there is a part two, 100 and some pages, full of data that can also be distilled to these graphics that were supposed to form a dashboard, perpetually updated, that could be referred to so that the city, for example, to pick on Geneva, since that's what I know best, not picking on them, but the city, that along Genesee Street, we have a certain type of large housing that back in the 20s was carved up into individual units and then became as like boarding house kind of, not totally individual units, and now are big buildings that are rental, whatever. In other parts of the city, like West High Street, we have the houses you were talking about before, the Sears catalog single-family homes. The idea that one housing solution is going to work on every street in Geneva is wrong. There has to be nuance, there has to be nimbleness, and there has to be a multi-pronged approach. So the things I put in that email, right, are supposed to recognize these very differing realities. If you want to revive a large, drafty, old house that needs a lot of maintenance, you need to have the nimbleness to turn that into something, whether you're condoizing it or turning it into a cooperative, models of which in other communities exist. You're getting more capital into that building that can maintain it, upgrade it, improve it, stabilize it, and provide meaningful housing choice to people. Instead, if you don't do anything, what do we get? Substandard, neglected, non-occupied by the owner housing units that people have no choice but to pay top dollar to live in because there's nothing else. And that is doing a disservice to the economy of the community, to the residents of the community. And it's so short-sighted because those houses aren't going to get better with neglect.
Nope.
So the problem is just going to increase. But it takes some actual truthful discussion about real stuff instead of these silly flyers that sensationalize topics and take our eye off the ball. We've got a project that's talking about bringing in units, 10 units for people who make up to $77,000 a year, 27 units for people who make up to $58,000 a year. And there's a flyer going around saying this is subsidized low-income affordable housing. First of all, I hate that people want to weaponize income in that way in the first place. But second of all, they're also wrong on the numbers. If you want to tell someone in Geneva who makes $77,000 that they're low-income housing, under the definitions, you might be right. That is affordable now. That is considered eligible for affordable housing these days. But people don't see themselves as being in that group. So it's easy for them to marginalize, castigate, put down people that they think need help, when it's like, no, that's a new affordable housing number that people should be able to get behind. And they just don't know. Like, I can't say enough how frustrating it is to have a city government run by people who just don't know their job. Now, the staff do, but look at how they get treated. But we've got elected officials who, I don't know if they don't care or they're not capable of. I think they are just afraid, because if you know what's going on, then you got to do something about it. So I think it's easier for them to have this, see no evil, hear no evil, speak no evil, except they're speaking a lot of stuff that they shouldn't.
Well, and that's what you're describing as a Geneva situation. But again, I just remind people, these things are happening in every community.
And I didn't mean to say it's specific to us. This happens all over the place, unfortunately.
And no, I'm thinking of a couple projects in Canandaigua that have been met with a lot of the same stuff. And, it's now been almost 3 years since I did a series, local election year series, where I interviewed candidates running for various offices. And, it was Canandaigua City Council candidates that I was interviewing in 2023, and every single one of them cited the percentage of community members who were renting. It was over 65%, as being basically an unsustainable number, and they needed to find ways to get more home ownership. And despite that, Canandaigua's fallen victim to a lot of the same things that other communities have fallen victim to, with, a few people turning out and slowing projects down. Yes, they have been better than most in getting things done, but the bar is very low, and they're always susceptible. And it doesn't matter if it's Canandaigua, if it's Geneva, if it's the smallest town you can possibly imagine. Present day, every single municipality is prone to that kind of leery feeling that comes around when one person speaks out and says, this project is bad because, and then cites literally anything.
Right.
It doesn't have to be merit-based. It doesn't have to be fact-based. It could just be literally anything. And it typically is enough to slow down or stop entirely. So that's just, I think that's where we have to leave it, because we've covered a lot of ground this hour. But housing, it's not going away. And all of the reports that we talked about, we'll link to in the show notes. So if you want to see those, you can read those documents. You can read a 100-page comp plan. You can read a 160-page housing study from Ontario County, and some of the others that exist too. But that'll do it for this episode. If you'd like to get in touch with the show, you can send us an email at debrief@fingerlakes1.com. Thanks for listening. We'll see you next time.